All right, everybody, welcome back. So we are moving into almost our last week. This is our last full week of the semester, and then we'll have a couple of days of next week where we will be wrapping up like two more topics, and the 20th is the last day that anything will be due, and that's it for you guys. You are done with this year. So again, 20th is also when you want to turn in missing assignments. So if you are missing stuff, get it in so you can get those points. My notes videos this week might be a little bit less enthusiastic. My ongoing sickness has kind of flared up again, so I'm just doing what I can to get these out there so you don't have to take notes with no lecture again like you've had to do a few times. So last week we got through basically what was going on with World War II in Europe. We talked about what was going on in like Asia and the Pacific with Japan. We very briefly talked about like Pearl Harbor and America getting pulled in. But unlike World War I, America is actually a pretty big part of World War II. It's not like World War I where we roll in at the end of the war and just kind of like clear up what was already pretty much a done deal. We are actually involved in this war from pretty early on because of Pearl Harbor, but even a little bit not officially before that, but definitely a little bit before that unofficially. So let's look at America during World War II. So before the war happened, we had neutrality. And you can't see it, but I'm doing air quotes when I say neutrality here. Because remember that after World War I, America chose not to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. And a big part of that was because America did not want to get involved with the League of Nations. We did not want to get pulled into European conflicts again. So America was very concerned about getting involved in another European conflict. So Congress passed a bunch of laws to stop any like official giving of supplies to Europe. We were still doing trade, but even that was limited. Basically, Congress wanted to keep us out of it. FDR, though, really wanted to support Britain. So FDR, still trying to support Europe, decided to bend those rules quite a bit. The first way he does that is the Lend-Lease Act in 1941. So this is going to be the year that America eventually does enter the war. But basically, the Lend-Lease Act says that the U.S. is allowed to lend or lease materials to allies. Leasing materials is basically like lending it, but for money. And then the payment for that stuff will be worked out later. I guess technically this wasn't like the first official thing, but this is like the big one. So basically, if you're leasing with payment to be worked out later, you're kind of just giving that stuff to them. And in total, we give about $50 billion worth of stuff, mostly to Britain, but we do actually also give stuff to Russia as well, which is important because when we get in, well, we're not going to get into the Cold War, but next year in U.S. history, when you get into the Cold War, one of Russia's big complaints is that America and Britain intentionally dragged out the war and didn't help Russia at all. And because of that, Russia suffered a lot during the war, and Russia did suffer a lot during the war. And we definitely could have helped them out more, and we viewed them as an enemy during the war. But we did actually supply them with stuff through the Lend-Lease Act. But most of that, $50 billion, in today's money, $700 billion, was to Britain. And obviously not to France, because France was already out. So we start to get involved a little bit unofficially militarily as well. So there's this thing called the Atlantic Charter, which is a document that is worked out between FDR and Churchill. FDR, of course, the President of America, and Churchill, the leader of Britain. They were already talking about an alliance, and specifically the Atlantic Charter was talking about what would Europe look like if Britain and America were to beat Germany. So obviously it's on their mind. Then Pearl Harbor rolls around. FDR gives that famous speech, "It's a day that will live in infamy." He convinces Congress to declare war. It's a pretty easy thing to convince them of because we were just attacked. Because Japan is allied with Germany, that means we get pulled in as well. And this, of course, being Hitler over here, like, what? At that point, we now get to fight. Eisenhower is going to lead our forces in Europe. He's also going to later be a president of America. MacArthur is going to lead our forces in the Pacific. I mean, usually you'd want to remember this for the test, but there's no test, so it doesn't really matter all that much. But yeah, these two guys are going to be pretty important names when it comes to history and fighting. Usually we would listen to this song. It's actually a pretty good one. If you are a fan of Linkin Park at all, one of the members of Linkin Park actually... I say that he made this group called Fort Minor, but they only ever actually released one album. But Kenji is a song from it, and it is specifically about another thing that America does during the war, because we're going to talk about the fighting in the next PowerPoint and the ones after that. We're going to look at the domestic stuff in America, though, and there is one incredibly significant thing that America does domestically during World War II, and that is Executive Order 9066, also known as Japanese internment. So basically, in 1942, almost right after Pearl Harbor happened, because remember, Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941, so at the very end of the year, FDR issued by executive order, so this wasn't even a law passed by Congress, although to be fair, if Congress voted on it, they would have passed it. So it's not like this is only FDR's idea. This was coming if it was an executive order or if it was passed by Congress. So Executive Order 9066 said that all Japanese Americans living on the West Coast were to report to gathering areas where they would be moved to camps that were away from the coast, and they would be imprisoned there for the duration of the war to keep everything safe. This would affect about 120,000 Japanese Americans. Of those 120,000, 62% were American citizens. That means they were born in America. They were not from Japan. Their parents moved from Japan to America, and they were born there. They were second or even third generation immigrants, which means at best they had a passing connection to Japan. This, of course, isn't really going to affect, for example, Japanese Americans on the East Coast in the same way, but there's not really that many Japanese Americans on the East Coast at this time period because Japanese immigrants came to the West Coast. So most Japanese immigrants were on the West Coast. The obvious question here is why? Why would you do this? And America has an answer, and that answer is spies. So basically, their argument, or our argument, was that the Japanese Americans were more loyal to the Japanese government than they were to the American government, and they were going to feed intelligence to the Japanese government, or they might try to sabotage American production or carry out attacks on America, and it wasn't safe to keep them out in society. There are, however, a number of factors that undermine that quite significantly. And I'll talk about these ones first, and then there's a couple of follow-ups that I'll just kind of add on a separate note. The first one is that the alternative argument, if you ever heard of Occam's razor, it's the idea that if there's a simple explanation for a problem, that is generally going to be more likely than a complex problem. And the idea of a bunch of Japanese Americans, 62% of which have no connection to Japan at all, somehow forming this extensive spy network and spying on America is a lot less likely than the fact that America was racist. There was already a huge amount of anti-Asian racism in America, and there wasn't really much distinction between different Asian groups, but there was especially Chinese racism, and then there was Japanese racism on top of that. There were things like the Chinese Exclusion Act that didn't even allow Chinese people to immigrate to America. There was the Gentlemen's Agreement that made it so Japanese people had a much harder time immigrating to America. There was all kinds of laws against them. Did you know that California, at one point in our history, we had a law that created a public holiday so everybody in the state can get that day off, but you had to use that day to protest Chinese immigrants? That was a law that was passed by Congress in California. And again, you're like, wait a minute, that's Chinese immigrants. people at that time, it was Asian in general, right? So they're not really differentiating between Chinese and Japanese. So there was a lot of anti-Asian, specifically anti-Japan sentiment in the first place, and then Pearl Harbor happens on top of that, which makes people hate Japanese people even more. That's why I mentioned before that this is a slur. I mean, that's a slur. You could see how it's being used here. I love, by the way, the irony in this photo, but she shouldn't be there. That's a white man's neighborhood. So she's being inconsistent in her bigotry, and that's just not cool. So Hawaii is our other example of why the spy excuse is not really, doesn't hold water. Hawaii had 150,000 Japanese citizens. There was way more Japanese people in Hawaii, much like there is today, because it's way closer to Japan than it is, than the West Coast is. So Hawaii only relocated about 1,200 of their 150,000 Japanese citizens, and they had no problems with spies. And if you're going to spy on America, it's way easier to do it from Hawaii because that's way closer to Japan, right? The other things to kind of add in quickly on top of that, number one is FDR, before Pearl Harbor had happened, because, again, America kind of knew that conflict with Japan was coming, he actually ordered a secret investigation done by the FBI into Japanese Americans to figure out if there was this thing that he referred to as a Japanese problem. And the Japanese problem was, are Japanese Americans loyal to America, or are they loyal to Japan? And the results of that investigation, again, which happened before Pearl Harbor, so he knew this in advance and he still issued this executive order, the results of that investigation were there is no Japanese problem. Japanese Americans are loyal to America. Finally, one other thing to point out, if we were really so concerned about spies, there would have been a massive incarceration and internment of Italian Americans and German Americans as well, because there were way more of those, and we were very much focused on fighting Italy and Germany. And while some German Americans and Italian Americans were arrested, it was a much smaller scale. They weren't out there like relocating all of them and rounding them up and putting them into camps. So it's hard to view this as anything but the direct result of racism. So in these camps where these Japanese Americans are rounded up into, they're technically provided with food and shelter and what have you, but the food is incredibly sparse and mediocre. You're basically being given gruel and poor quality food, and often not quite enough food, so you're not starving, but you're definitely not full most of the time. And the shelter is usually going to be these like slapped together buildings. They mostly, they didn't have incarceration camps set up, right? These internment camps had to be built really quickly. So they slapped together these things mostly out of like sheet metal. That means that they're not insulated. So in the summer it's super hot, in the winter it's super cold. They're not being given enough blankets or clothes or supplies. The Japanese internees were only allowed to bring one bag for each person for their stuff to bring with them. So they couldn't bring their stuff. They had to leave a lot of it behind. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire with armed guards and like turrets with guns on them, all facing inwards. It was not super common, but there are actually multiple reports of Japanese internees being shot. The official excuse for it was, well, they were trying to escape. But a lot of first-hand accounts would say that the internees would actually get shot just for getting too close to the fence, not even for trying to leave the camp, just for getting too close to the fence and closing it. Some of the camps did allow the internees to work to gain money during the time in there, but the wages were always incredibly low, and it was inconsistent, and it was going to be hard, like physical labor. So basically, if you were a Japanese American, you had to leave all your stuff behind. You then had to go into a camp where, at best, you had a chance to earn a meager amount of money, and you were going to be there for the next 3 years. Maybe even a little bit more if you were one of the later ones. So your life basically gets thrown away, and then you lose everything. Because think about it, how many people just outright own their house or own their business, right? Most people have to pay back a loan, right? A mortgage, or they have to pay property taxes. If you don't pay that, what happens to your stuff? it gets seized, it gets taken away. So you're going to lose pretty much everything you have while you're in these internment camps. Once the war finally ends, the internees go home, and again, they lose everything. And even if they did have a home or a shop left that was not seized, they would often come back to a scene like this because their neighbors or their community members knew that they were Japanese, right? So windows were broken, houses were looted, sometimes burned down, destroyed, covered in graffiti. I mean, who's gonna want to live in that neighborhood at that point? You come back and this is what you find. Like, you're not gonna feel safe there ever. Like, you can't stay in that house. Even if you wanted to stay in that house, it's been destroyed and you don't have the money to fix it back up again because you lost all your money when you were in the internment camp. Because of this whole situation, most internees basically had to restart their lives from scratch, which is extra insulting when you think about it, because even if they were a second generation immigrant family, think about the experience of an immigrant. An immigrant coming to America means you've already left your life behind once and restarted it in a new country. And a second generation immigrant, like, you're not necessarily restarting your life, but you're in a family that had to restart their life. And now you have to restart your life once again in the same country. And you didn't even do anything wrong, because remember, these people were arrested under the excuse that they might be spies, but there's no evidence that any of them were spies. So you did nothing wrong and you lost everything. Usually we would talk about this. We're not going to now. Do I not? Maybe I include it in a different one. If not, I'll have to talk about them later. There was a Japanese American unit that usually gets talked about here. Maybe I leave it for U.S. history. I'll have to check my other PowerPoint and see if it's there. If it's not, then maybe I'll mention it in the Pacific Front PowerPoint that we do. My brain is scattered because of sickness. Sorry. So that's where we're going to leave it for here. And next time we will talk about some of the fighting that goes on in the Pacific. Thank you for watching. Bye.